Hey all, here at OS Reviews. In today's video, we will be revisiting the Moto Razr 2019. So this was among the first generation of foldable phones, technically becoming available to purchase in early 2020. So it's a device that's now about 2 years old, and back when it was released, it was definitely a very expensive phone because the technology of making a bendable display was still very new. But one thing that we have seen is foldable form factors, especially now pushed out by brands like Samsung and Huawei, have started to go over more iterations, and as a result, the pricing is now starting to come down. In fact, the reason for this video partially is you can now find this for under $200 when shopping around, and that is without a contract. In fact, often even lower if you are willing to do some more price hunting. So that now puts it into more of a affordable / even budget territory. The price, in fact, comparable to normal phones without the folding mechanism. So at this point, it becomes, why not? It's something more fun, it's accessible. So revisiting the design here, the Motorola Razr Reloaded was obviously inspired by the original iconic Razer V3 that was incredibly popular in the early 2000s. So this foldable form factor is in a way quite deliberate in terms of getting you that nostalgic feel, as the original Razer was many folks' first memories of using a cell phone or a flip phone. We still have this iconic chin at the very bottom there, but now it houses a fingerprint scanner, which is actually very well optimized. It's super fast and responsive. You can long hold, in fact, to turn off the display. Even retains some of that cutout or notch design, but obviously now contains a front-facing camera rated at 5 megapixels, earpiece, and proximity light sensor. Now there is even a really fun Easter egg function, which is the retro Razer interface that basically now tries to resemble the original Razer even more, and you can tell here that the height of both phones are in fact pretty much identical. It's just a bit more wide to accommodate this bigger display.
Hello, Moto.
Otherwise, the display on the inside measures again 6.2 inches diagonally. It's a POLED screen, which is incredibly contrast-rich and just super vibrant, as well as crystal clear, because there is no film or additional layer of glass on top of it. It feels like you're just interacting with pixels directly. Now, this phone, though, does not have a super fast refresh rate, so it's just standard 60 Hz, and one spec that might seem a little disappointing is it's technically just a little higher than HD+, which means it's unfortunately not even full HD resolution, but it doesn't really matter, I suppose. At the end of the day, things are still clear enough, and you can't really tell a huge difference unless you are comparing it side by side with a higher resolution screen or doing more pixel peeping. Now, the implementation of the hinge on this original folding Razr, I think, has also held up quite well. Motorola had implemented this teardrop design, which has less of a noticeable crease as you're running your fingers along, so everything seems mostly flat, even though it is a plastic screen, which can be a little bit more prone to scratching and denting if you're pressing too hard, but typical usage, it still has held up quite well, as you can see, and it feels pretty smooth and responsive. Again, that part of that hinge mechanism which is making this possible is pushing the screen inside like this, that you can also use to hang up on calls like the original Razer did back in the day. Pretty satisfying. And again, obviously now pushes the phone into this super portable form factor that can easily slide into pockets, maybe purse for women, and just makes it easier to transport despite being a full-sized phone. That is always going to be one of the benefits, and the internal screen will be protected from damage as well. So overall, it is pretty neat in that sense, although of course there is one argument, which is when looking at a foldable, should you purchase something which folds down to something smaller like this, or should you look at something like the Samsung Galaxy Fold, which will transform from a regular size phone into a tablet sized device? I think the latter might be a little bit more practical in terms of giving us more features, but it's undeniable that this is still going to be able to find a demographic of folks that find it valuable. People that want to travel light and have smaller pockets, this can still come in incredibly handy. Now again, the hinge mechanism, I think, has also done well in terms of holding up. That is one contrast with Samsung's first generation flipping phone, the Galaxy Z Flip, used the ultra-thin glass, which definitely seems cooler on paper, and it is in fact something that feels more firm as you're pressing down. But the issue is the display is mostly glued down, aside from this tiny sliver that allows the folding to occur. And as a result, this point here for folding just has a little bit more stress versus the larger radius curve, and it can be a little bit more prone to cracking and creating a more obvious crease over repeated usage. There's a bit more damage that's common if you are shopping online. With that being said, specs are an area where Motorola's implementation was definitely inferior to Samsung's Galaxy Z Flip, as they were mostly going along the route of nostalgia, and with all the engineering feats that they had to accomplish, it took more time to develop, and by the time it was released, some of those specs were just a bit more outdated. So as a quick reference, it is rocking the Qualcomm Snapdragon 710 processor, which is still a pretty solid mid-tier chipset. In fact, it's stronger than the Snapdragon 660, which I did think worked well on devices I tried back in the day. But the issue was this was a very expensive flagship when new. Now, again, at under $200, it's a lot more easy to swallow, but still it's definitely weaker than the Snapdragon 855 that was found on the competing Samsung Galaxy Z Flip. And here's just a close-up view again of the design, especially the hinge here, which offers what reminds me of kind of a watch band design, similar to on some of the Yoga Book, Lenovo Yoga products. It has some aluminum rails that makes it feel quite solid. In fact, the weight of this phone is pretty surprising. Coming in at 205 grams, that's actually around the same as the OnePlus 7 Pro, which is a phone that has a substantially larger display and battery. So it makes this phone actually feel like a bit of a tank when you're holding it. We will have access again on the front to a 2.7-inch display, which is also AMOLED, and this is one area where Motorola definitely had an advantage over Samsung's solution, which has a significantly smaller cover display. It was just this tiny little pill-shaped thing, versus the Motorola Razr allowed you to also watch videos, interact with any program basically. You can use this like a mini phone with a 2.7-inch display, which I also think is just incredibly cool. In fact, even browse the web if you wanted to. It will also pop up the virtual keyboard, and you can use swipe or even voice recognition to input and search things along. So it was a lot more practical in this sense. A lot of things you can do without even necessarily opening the phone every single time. So it has that cool factor of being both this super tiny phone that allows you to do everything here, but in addition to being a folding phone. Perhaps the other application that is nice about this is using it as a lens to check out and take selfies with, and you would obviously be using the primary camera instead of the 5-megapixel selfie lens. This front display, of course, is protected by Corning Gorilla Glass. Otherwise, it also houses a 16-megapixel front-facing camera along with an LED flash, but there are no additional lenses on this phone, so you won't find something like an ultra-wide or an additional macro or telescope lens. Overall, though, I think that the design still feels pretty premium. Motorola did come out with a second generation of the Razr, dubbed the Razr 5G 2020 edition, and that model, as the name implies, just features 5G support. Form factor remains the same display experience as well. One other difference is on the original version, we did have more of this textured plastic back, which I actually do prefer because it feels pretty robust and fairly resistant to scratching and damaging it just by putting it down. You don't even need to necessarily have a case on, versus the slightly newer model then changed this to glass, just like on Samsung's model, which makes it a lot more slippery. The bottom here houses a USB Type-C for charging, supporting 15 watts, which is also a little slow. And it also touches on the battery of this phone, which is just rocking a 2,510 milliamp hour capacity cell. That was also one thing that just unfortunately is a weakness on this particular device. Even though the Snapdragon 710 is an energy-efficient chipset, I was still often reaching for the charger before I ended the day. Volume and the typical power keys located on the right-hand spine, and when the phone is closed, the keys will still properly map and work accordingly, which is good. The power key here is textured, so you can delineate it more easily, although one thing that I will say is I do find the buttons themselves to be pretty small in terms of size. Just as reference, here is the Samsung Z Flip's power key, which you can see it's almost 2 times the size of Motorola's implementation, even as large as the volume keys. Now let's take a closer look at the software experience next. And inside we are now looking at Android 11 after receiving a software update. Motorola's interface on top of Android, though, is thankfully fairly minimal and light, so you won't find too much bloatware here aside from some carrier-specific references. The original Razr here first came out on Verizon, so that's why you may see some additional quote-unquote bloatware, but that can be largely uninstalled if not needed. And then we have just the standard Google apps. Some other system specs include 6 gigabytes of RAM coupled with 128 gigs of built-in storage. So I think the RAM part is also fine. Of course, 8 gigs is a little bit more of the norm, even back then for a flagship, but it will still, for the most part, get your work done. Otherwise, comes equipped with the standard NFC for contactless mobile payment, GPS, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, we've come to expect. Although, of course, with the folding phone in this first generation form factor, there was no IP water resistance, but overall still seems to have held up well enough in terms of regular day-to-day usage. Let's take a closer look at the camera performance next. So as aforementioned, I think this is an area of relative weakness, but sometimes the shutter speed can even be a little slow. As you can see there, it just takes a second to capture versus something more instantaneous that we may expect from a flagship experience. However, there are plenty of settings that you can play around with. Portrait modes, which it's simulating using that single lens, but still seems to be doing okay. It just takes a little longer to process. Auto HDR, as well as some more filters and effects, can also be applied as we have expected. Now, video resolution, you can also capture up to 4K, but definitely think about it more as a entry level / mid-end camera performance. But overall, colors and images can still be fairly realistic, if not super saturated, and good enough just to capture some of your memories when using the device. So it's not going to necessarily be an area that really hinders you from snapping away, but definitely it's not going to be its strength. Now, one other thing I was a little surprised about when using this phone is that it does get warm, especially if you are using the camera, taking a lot of images, or doing some more demanding tasks like some games. The bottom half of the phone gets very obviously toasty. Never too hot that it becomes uncomfortable to use, but to the extent that I was surprised because, again, the Snapdragon 710, Snapdragon 660 are both very energy efficient chips. Anyways, here is the YouTube playback experience. We can also try and see what the speakers here sound like by cranking things higher. Alright, so takeaway being that it sounds pretty decent. It doesn't, of course, give you as much immersion as a true stereo speaker, but you can also listen to music with the phone folded down, and in that mode it makes perhaps a little more sense, because when you are folding it shut, obviously the speaker there will be blocked, and in this sense, the music will just be blasting out from the bottom of the device anyways. It doesn't sound too hollow or thin, so it sounds fine, I would say, and overall gets you a pretty immersive experience when it comes to just watching back videos as a whole. Although I will say that the slightly thinner shape of the phone as compared to maybe a normal device does mean that you are maybe losing out on a little bit of the image as you are zooming in. Whether it's YouTube or Netflix, it's an area that you shouldn't have too much issues here. The overall, again, performance level of the 710 is similar to top-of-the-line Qualcomm Snapdragon chips in the 835, 845 series, so not the newest, but still is decent enough when it comes to loading back pages pretty quickly, and text still flows and renders relatively well. So in terms of just getting things done when it comes to checking out the news, reading back some articles, you shouldn't have too much complaints here. Other mainstays of Motorola phones, including the chop motion to turn on the flashlight, can also be found here. Now, with that being said, multitasking is an area that, although certainly works, maybe is not quite as well optimized, I have to admit, as on Samsung's alternatives, just because the hinge here only holds the phone open in this one position. That is, you aren't able to, say, fold it like a mini laptop and have it stand upright. It always wants to flick itself open thanks to that spring-loaded design. That is more or less it as far as our revisited review of the original Motorola Razr foldable form factor phone here in 2022, almost 2 years later. And I guess the most surprising thing, as always, is how quickly technology degrades in terms of pricing and accessibility. So finally, we are looking at now pretty much the cheapest foldable phone that you can find, ironically also the first foldable that was available in the US. A very sharp reduction, in fact almost 90% from the $1,500 to now, let's say $200, $150 that you can find it now in used condition. That puts it again into just very affordable territory. As we've talked about, certain elements of this phone in terms of the basics, call quality, using it for watching videos, it certainly does hold up, and regular navigation doesn't seem to be too problematic. The overall longevity of the phone also seems decent thanks to that teardrop shape for the hinge. You can check out more details about this phone in links down below, but that's been our revisited look at the very interesting foldable Motorola Razr here from 2020.